From the pulpit to the streets, we stand firm. Sound doctrine and truth, let the fire burn. By grace we live, by faith we go, proclaiming Christ to all we know. Stay Baptist, stay bold. Truth and love, let the scriptures unfold. From creation to the end, we break it down. Real combos, Christ wears the crown. Stay Baptist, stay bold. Truth and love, let the scriptures unfold. From creation to the end, we break it down. Shifting sand, the gospel reigns across the land. G220, shining the light, sharing his word both day and night. Truth and love, from creation to the end, we break it down. Real combo.
And welcome to another episode of G220 Radio. We want to thank you for tuning into the program tonight. It's been a minute. It's been a while. We've kind of had some things going on in life. You know, life happens, and so we had to adjust. But we are back tonight. We're going to be talking about church history, our series in church history, and we're going to be talking about the rise of Islam. That's Mike, and this is Ricky. We want to welcome you again to the program here tonight on G220 Radio. Mike, it's been a minute since we've been in this church history series. Maybe you want to kind of catch us up before we move into this aspect and talk about the rise of Islam.
Yeah, so we've been going through church history, I think one way to say is that it has been kind of unified. And then we started in the 400s, specifically with 415, if we wanted to put a date on it, of when Rome falls. Now that there's kind of this separation happening between the Eastern Church in the East, the Greek, and the Western Church, the Latin Church in the West. And there's tensions between the two. They're not being completely unified. There are similarities in doctrines, but because the West is fighting the Goths, they are dealing with life and death. And in the East, they're debating how many wills does God have, or how many wills does Jesus have? And there's now political power in that. You have the Monophysites, which is going to be important for our discussion today, and the Nestorians. And the last episode we talked about Justinian, how he tried to bring everyone together. That was his goal. He kind of brought the old Roman Empire together in kind of a political way, but he could never really bring the church back into unity. There is too much separation. There's too many differences between the Monophysites and the Nestorians and what we would call the Orthodox believers, and then the Roman Catholicism there under the Bishop of Rome. And this is where we find ourselves now. This is the environment we have, and really we're now in a change between the fathers and the medieval church, and there is a lot that is happening in between it. We're going to kind of focus on the East, and really this is going to be the last kind of show focusing on the Orthodox kind of primarily. We're coming up to the Great Schism in a few hundred years. We're really going to be start shifting our focus in the West. That's the tradition we come out of as being Reformed Baptists through the Protestant Reformation. We are part of the Western Church, and as the tradition falls, as we think through our heritage. So we're going to start seeing that shift a lot more in how we think about church history kind of narrowing down. There is just a lot to be going on and throughout, but kind of primarily in a lot of it because we're in the West, we'll be focusing on that. And what makes this kind of a pivotal time is we have at the title of the show, the rise of Islam. Islam is going to become a important factor, and it's going to bring a different age into the church, and it's going to change the landscape quite dramatically as we think about it in that way. So that's why we're going to dedicate an entire show just to understand not only the rise of Islam, but how does this rise of Islam interact with now the Christian church over the next couple hundred years. There's not going to be kind of a set end date here because of wars and stuff that kind of draws on, but we're looking at about 100 to 200 years when we think about this time period and what happens. It is so pivotal, and the effects are still here today. We still deal with these tensions with Islam. I mean, we're currently at war unofficially with Iran. We're having military operations happening there. That's important because of Iran, and their kind of sect of Islam is different than the sect of Islam that we see maybe in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. And we'll even talk a little bit about that, why that is, because it's all plays an important aspect of what is going to now happen and really transpire for the rest of church history in some sense.
Yeah. It's very important as we're moving through church history. This is a big part of events that happened and unfolded in church history. And so we can't do church history without interacting with this time period and what is going on as Islam is coming into play, coming into power, coming into interacting with the Christian church. And so it's important, again, that we get a good understanding of that from church history, because it does affect us, as you said, even to this day. You think, where does this all begin? And you go all the way back to Abraham in the book of Genesis, when he takes Sarah's maid, Sarah's servant, Hagar, and he has this son through him, Ishmael. And you have these Mohammedans from this point on. And then we see this development of Islam, which it comes from this root word, which just really means to surrender, to submit oneself to. And so when we hear the words, or somebody identifies as a Muslim, they are one who is submitting themselves to Allah, submitting themselves to the word of Allah through the Quran. And so it's vitally important we understand the beginning, Genesis. This affects us, comes into play, and then now in church history, we're going to see this movement kind of go through from the east into the west, kind of Western world. And so, Mike, go ahead and kick us off, man.
Yeah, just before
one more thing too before you jump in. I'm sorry, I was going to make this announcement. Obviously, if you're watching and you can still hear me, it's better to watch on YouTube. I looked at the Facebook thing, and it looks like it's not properly functioning right. It might just be on my end, but it says there was some difficulties. So that's why I want to encourage you, watch us on YouTube. You're going to get a better experience, I think, overall. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so you mentioned Mohammedans. I think to start the show, I'll probably use Islam, Muslims. That's the current vernacular. If you read older materials in church history, oftentimes they are referred to as the Mohammedans. That is, so if that slips out, just some of that is just reading some of the old dead guys as they interact with Islam. They oftentimes will use that vernacular with it. So, but to start off, we're going to kind of not understand. We're gonna look at Muhammad. Obviously, He is the founder of Islam. There's a lot of importance there. And what happens in his life and interactions he has will come to play later on, especially when you think of the Quran and how it talks about Jesus and Mary. It's interactions that he is going to have. So we have this idea of Muhammad, or not the idea, Muhammad. He's born in Mecca. That's where the holy place is now. Both his parents die. His dad dies before he's born and very young. His mom dies a little bit later. So he lives with his uncle. His uncle is poor. He becomes a merchant, which is what his uncle did, and was good at selling things. He became quite good at selling things. He was so successful in being a merchant that the person he was working for, this female who was 15 years older than him, decided to get married. So they get married. I think he's 25, she's 40. And so, but being a merchant and we're in the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, you think of modern day Iraq, in this kind of area that he's traveling around and he gets to meet different communities. He meets Jews. They're still kind of scattered from the temple, fall of the temple. He gets to meet Nestorian Christians. So as we talked about, the Christians who held to the beliefs of Nestorius, the understanding that there is that Jesus has two natures and two wills that are separated. So when they're exiled out of the Byzantine Empire, they go to Saudi Arabia, modern day Saudi Arabia. They go to the Persian area. So there is a decent amount of crowds there. There's a decent amount of monophysites in the Arabian Peninsula. They find their homes in Egypt, as we've talked about it, but they're out.
Hold on,
and
dropped off the screen there. I just pulled you back in.
So there's a lot of historians to recount, but there's a lot of monophysites. So the opposite end, that there is this combination between Jesus's humanity and his divinity into one. We talked about that on our last show on with heresies. We've talked about it before, but there's a large amount of this. So these are the types of Christians that Muhammad is interacting with in the Persian Empire. There are some Christians who are hermits that are out in the desert. Oftentimes we refer to them as the desert fathers at times. He's going to have some interaction with them, but the hermits, they're tending to stay away, and they're kind of small and independent. So he's not really dealing and interacting with very much. And so he's dealing with all these, well, for the sake of how we talk about it, these Abrahamic religions, Judaism, specifically Judaism and Christianity, that he is thinking through this. He's kind of agnostic at best during this time. So he's going to later come and embrace this idea of God. It's not Christianity, it's not Judaism as it comes out. And around 610 or so, he starts receiving visions from Allah. Now, Allah is the Islamic word for God. This causes debates now whether Christians should use Allah in Muslim countries, because Arabic, it's God. It's what they use for God. He's taking that name. So again, that's not a debate for this podcast, but this is something to note of, that Muhammad is using the word God to describe now this being who's giving and receiving him visions. Now, Muhammad, as it goes, is not quite convinced that these are actual visions from God, from Allah. It's in fact his wife who pushes him and encourages him to kind of embrace them as being divine. And so as she pushes him, as he keeps receiving these visions, essentially he starts teaching these things. And now you have this idea of Islam. And now, so we can say 610 is kind of the start of the religion that would become known as Islam. You have anything to
Yeah, like you said
say?
there, so you've got Muhammad. He's in this area, and in the beginning of his life there, getting he's it's not a hatred for Jews or a hatred for Christians. He's
Mhm,
around them. He's influenced by them. Um, he doesn't write these things down. He's not an educated individual like that, and so he doesn't write these things down. So we see later a lot of the things that he brings into this religion, he does off of memory and sometimes confusing things. Because again, we talked about Roman Catholicism before. We've talked about it on other previous shows. The doctrine of the uh, how they've come to worship Mary. It
mhm.
was developed over time. It isn't until I think like the 1800s or something like that before she's even brought up as in,
Dogmatized.
yeah, doctrine of the Immaculate Conception or something like that. It's not until late in history. But there are developments where you're seeing this Roman influence, where there are people within the church that are praying to Mary
Mhm,
and praying to Jesus, and you see this because again he's being influenced by false teachers. He's being influenced by sects of Christianity that have been pushed out because they're teaching falsely, and Jews who have their view of Jesus as well. And so, and if you look in the Quran in 5:116, it says this: "And behold, Allah will say, O Jesus, the son of Mary, didst thou say unto men, worship me and my mother as gods in degradation of Allah? And he will say, speaking of Jesus, glory to thee, never could I say what I had no right to say. Had I such a thing, thou wouldst indeed have known it. Thou knowest what is in my heart, though I know, though, though, I'm sorry, though I know not what it is thine, for thou knowest in full all that is hidden." So
mhm,
in the Quran, they're saying, look, you don't worship this. And Muslims today, they will recite, we do not follow Jesus. We do not worship Jesus or Mary. We don't pray to them.
mhm,
Allah is one. It's monotheistic. Um, but they don't understand the Trinity. They kind of confuse it. And this kind of plays out because Muhammad, again, he's getting these teachings and he's not fully grasping them all and doesn't write it down, so he doesn't remember what he's being told ultimately. And so some of this is just a kind of a new understanding of Christianity with some bad teaching, maybe some true teachings, but just
mhm.
kind of combining them together.
Yeah, and I think that that's important. Like when we think about even in our evangelism Muslims, like there is this misconception of what we believe. Obviously, they're going to hold to what Muhammad said, or according what they say accordingly, in the Quran. But I think it's valid to really question that. Is that truly what is Orthodox believers? Like again, we can see in history the effects of false teaching. It's not even in the empire at this point. It's outside, and yet here's this, and no one would have known it at the time. Hindsight is always 2020. This start of this religion that is going to be so ravenous for power that they just go. And we see this, in their teachings when we think about it. So not we'll have a show in a couple weeks or sometime soon that will dive more into specific teachings of Islam, but there are some things that we should know of Islam because that's how this is going to play out and affects how even Christians interact with Muslims even during this time.
Yeah. I think too, like you said, so he's having these interactions with this spirit that's coming to him.
Mhm.
He later believes this is Gabriel, right? But he in the beginning, he believes he's being visited by a demon. But like as you said, but his wife convinces him, no, this is from God, right? We
Mhm.
should we should we should consider the first sign of something. Paul tells us in Galatians, even if an angel of light comes to you preaching something contrary.
Yeah.
And that's why, like you said, when we evangelize, when we are evangelizing Muslims, when we're evangelizing Hindus, when we're evangelizing atheists, not that we're perfect, but we want to be very particular and careful with our wording and how we are saying things so that we don't confuse people and tell them something that's contrary to the scripture so that they have the truth. Muhammad was a mess. He was confused with
Mhm.
a lot of what was going on, and he's starting this. He is, I believe, obviously being influenced by demonic entities to give him this religion, not of peace.
Yeah. So he starts this religion, and as you mentioned, it means submission is kind of the idea, and it's based off of his understanding of the unity of God. So I think oftentimes we associate, and I think even in some sense how it's portrayed, like this idea of Muslim is power, but it's Muhammad was concerned about the unity of God, specifically that the God is one. So as Christians, we believe God is triune. There is three, and yet they are one. The three persons in one nature. Islam denies this, and this becomes a center aspect of what Islam's believes. Um, he taught that the Trinity was paganism and that Jesus isn't God, just a forerunner prophet for Muhammad. And on top of that, Jesus didn't actually die on the cross because Allah wouldn't kill someone who is a good person. And so so you start seeing this aspect um building out of how um God's interaction, Allah's interaction with the world. But I think also not only is he's unified, he is wholly separated from creation. I was kind of when I was reading a little bit about this, it reminded me a little bit of deism. It's not quite the same as deism. I don't think it's quite the same as what we would know as deism, that God kind of sets everything in motions and steps away. Um, but you get that kind of idea that God is kind of he's outside of creation, which we believe, but he just kind of separated. He's not really involved with it as much. And yet he's the only one who has power. He has ultimate power. So Allah, one being, one person, has ultimate power. And then Jesus is just a prophet. And so these are kind of his, for lack of a better term, his theology of Allah. This is his doctrine of Allah as he builds out. And this then plays into the five pillars that we hear often. It's important. It is what Muslims live by. That is the confession. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. So they see Muhammad as the great prophet, greater than Jesus, greater than Moses. Um, the praying 5 times a day. We know this. They facing Mecca, the holy center of the holy city of Islam. They are to be giving charitable gifts of money to contribute to the poor. There is fasting for Ramadan that has just happened in the last couple months. It was a big deal because it started on the same day as Palm Sunday or Ash Wednesday, and so like people freaking out about that. And then, lastly, the pilgrimages to Mecca, which Muslims must try to make at least once. It's harder now because Saudi Arabia really restricts who can go to Mecca and how many people can go there. But these are the things they are to be doing. And then on top of these 5 pillars is this idea of jihad. And I think when we think of jihad, we think of kind of war, like going after people. In America, we are a subject of jihad. And the idea of jihad is not just war. I think that's how we understand it, because Muslim tends to spread by war, spread by violence. But it seems, at least in the earlier time, jihad was a also included a personal struggle to obey Allah. So a jihad would be, I think, if we wanted to relate it to Christian terms, kind of our progressive sanctification, that we're trying to obey God's will. Jihad has that personal struggle aspect, but also includes the spread of Islam. And as we'll see here, that spread will come by the sword mostly. That is how they conquer and get a lot of people. And all of this is kind of set on a foundation of the Hadith, which is kind of the path. So it's the Quran, kind of Muslims teaching, and the teaching, the verbal tradition from Muhammad. Ironically, it's kind of similar to the three-legged stool of Roman Catholicism, but I will not go there. But you have this kind of layered of the Quran is kind of the most, but there is this kind of consensus of how Muhammad had lived his life, is probably a better way to say it. So the Quran, his teaching, how he lived his life, and then a consensus of how to act within the Muslim community, usually done by Islamic legal scholars and who studied the Quran. And so that's kind of how they're teaching, and all this kind of leads to this idea of that Muhammad unifies the region. He spreads it by sword, he attacks, and he does it. But the soldiers are unafraid of death. They're sober, because you can't drink alcohol in Islam. So their mental capacity isn't hindered by the use of alcohol, but then they're just unafraid of death because of the reward they would receive in dying for the fight of Islam. And so they made him a very fierce army to go against. And I think will see that repeatedly throughout history, just how fierce they are as an army.
Yeah, I think come back and reiterate, what you're saying there. What you see with Muhammad early in his life is a getting along with people. He's trying to get along with Jews. He's trying to get along with. It wasn't a hatred because of someone's ethnic background. It was political. It was ideological. But you try to get along, and I think these are the 3 phases that we see with Islam even to this day. So we get along with you. We try to assimilate with you. Well, we don't assimilate with you. We try to get along, to live among you. Then we seek to try to gain a little bit of political power. And then when we are able to get political power, when we are able to get dominance in an area, we implement the Sharia law. We implement our law. We we
Mhm.
we then want to take over. And so when you see it with Muhammad in his life, same way it plays out today. First, you try to get along with people and promote your ideology and try to see it spread that way. Then when you gain some, when it's not you gain, you seek to gain political influence politically, then you take power, and then if it's not working, then you take dominance because now you're the dominant force and you
Mhm.
wield the sword. Same thing we see today. You look at places in the United States right now. You look overseas in France. You look overseas in England, Great Britain, and you see how they've come in and they begin to take power in certain places, political power, and now it's dangerous, like Sharia law. Up even here in Michigan,
Mhm.
there's places where Sharia law is dominant in that area, and they're trying to govern by that. And it does not, it cannot coexist with the Christian worldview. It just cannot. But this is how they do it, and they're also in it for the long game. They'll play the long game. Christians used to be big about having big families and having dominion and uh, procreating, making their, having their children, discipling their children being discipled and whatnot. Islam does that. They have large families, lots of children that they raise them up, discipling them.
Yeah. We can take we should in our fight do the same. So that's a little bit about Islam. There's some teaching there. Now we're going to see this play out in history. So moving back to the Byzantine Empire, there is a split geographically and theologically. We've already kind of talked about this. You have the Latin West, you have the Greek East. Um, Theologically, you have the Monophysites. They're in Egypt and kind of in that area. This is going to play an important part as we kind of talk about and go through this. And Islam is slowly growing in the Arabia Peninsula. Now there is the Persian War. The Persian Empire comes and attacks the Egypt area, and they are able to win. The Monophysites are excited because while they're in Byzantine Empire and they're Byzantine citizens, because they've been kind of excommunicated out of the church, they almost feel trapped within the Byzantine Empire. And so when the Persians come and defeat the Byzantine Empire in Egypt, it's almost this kind of freedom from being oppressed by your bigger brother. There's this freedom that they feel. And so they are quickly aligning themselves with now the Persian army. Now this time it's not as Islamic, this is Persia as a country. The Byzantine Empire, Hercules, goes and attacks, tries to reclaim the land, and he does. He's able to push them back into modern day Saudi Arabia, push him, keep getting them back, and takes a great toll on both his army and the Persian army. This becomes important of a battle because of what happened, because of how fierce the fighting was, how decimated both armies were. The area is now ripened for a stronger army to come in and take over. That's what Islam brings. Islam conquers Persia and now starts to attack the Byzantine Empire kind of in that southern aspect. They start attacking in 635. Alexandria in Egypt falls in 641. What you will see here is that for basically 100 years, Islam is going to decimate the Byzantine Empire. Just decimate it. It is unbelievable. So they start in Egypt, they take Alexander. They start going north. They take what is now Israel. They'll take what is now modern day Syria and going up into Turkey. And in 673, they attack Constantinople. It is a fierce battle, lasts for 5 years. The Byzantine Empire holds out. They have something, it's called Greek fire is the name. It was a chemical they were able to produce and make that would light on fire in contacts of water. So they could they basically shot this stuff at the Islamic Navy, the boats, as they're trying to attack and just destroy boats, kill their attackers. So Islam isn't strong enough to overtake Constantinople, at least this first time around. And so they're fighting up there. At the same time, they're still advancing in what is now northern Africa. So they've taken Egypt and now they're just kind of marching across the northern Africa. They're fighting the Berber people. They give up a fight, but because they're so overwhelming, a lot of times they're taking the treaties. Because in taking a treaty, they're still allowed to stay in their land. They just lose some privileges. They become a second-class citizen, but they're still protected. If Islam comes in and destroys you, you lose those protections. So there's a little treaty game going on as Islam marches across with their army in northern Africa. They're going to keep marching, and in 711 they enter Spain. They're in the Strait of Gibraltar. It's not very wide. It's very easy to cross. It separates the Mediterranean from the ocean. And they cross there and they continue their fight through Spain all the way up into modern day France. And the Franks, who we'll talk about in our next show, as we kind of go back and cover the rise of the Franks, ends their European tour with the Battle of Tours and starts pushing them back into Spain. And they stay in Spain for a while. In fact, there's still a region in northern Spain, just south of the French border, that has this, has a deep connection with the Middle Eastern people and a language that is similar to Islam. And it includes Barcelona. So there's, even today, we see that the people of Barcelona are not quite with everyone else in Spain. There is a political dynamic there. But we see here, I mean, they attack in 635. In less than 100 years, they have taken all the way up into modern day Turkey, all the way across northern Africa, have entered Spain, and was fighting in there. We're talking just devastation when it comes to what they were doing. And at the same time, in 656, so in the middle of all these campaigns, they lose unity. So 40 years-ish after Muhammad starts receiving the divisions, there is now this split in Islam with the Shia and the Sunnis. And we've heard these languages. This is what they're called. They're the two different ideas today. Shia, mostly in modern day Iran, believe that though God chooses leaders, that it needs to be someone within Muhammad's family. And the Sunnis basically believe that the leader doesn't have to be within Muhammad's leader. And so very early they experience a very big break that causes tensions even today between those two groups. And so I think you see I mean it just feels like Islam is all about the division and violence and attacking and even within themselves. I mean we tend to do that as Christians verbally, but they're doing it physical. But I think just to show like how fast they're changing the world. Like people are gonna have to start doing something. S- Like you just can't let them be this way. And then obviously with the Franks, in the battle tours, kind of ending them and pushing them back into Spain, marks a change. But that's at that point, it's too almost too late, and Islam is um, now a powerful world religion and a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah. Very, very fascinating and interesting. When you think about this and you think about, because I know sometimes people could be thinking and say, man, if it's not of God, if this is not a religion from the one true God which they worship, how are they able to have this type of dominance and just march through? But you got to understand how God does things, and He gives us ideas of what He does in the Scripture. He lays it
Yeah.
out. When Egypt sinned, or not Egypt, when Israel sinned, He brought in the Babylonians. He brought in the Persians. He brought in the Greeks and the Romans as judgment upon them. And so God uses nations in the world to come upon other nations in the world, or ideologies. Is Islam is not just a religion; it's a political ideology that is moving through as
Mhm.
well. Um, and He uses it to bring about His purposes. And so it's very, very fascinating when you think about it, because God ultimately has a plan, and we again will continue to see this as it unfolds. But it's just very fascinating to think about it, because history is so important for us in the Christian faith here.
Yeah, and if we remember, parts of these areas too have already been conquered by the Visigoths. Like you already have kind of German nomads, probably coming from modern day Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, getting pushed out by the Mongols, being pushed in there. For 200 years they've had their thing, and now the Muslims come in and they assert their dominance. And so now Christians in these areas have to figure out how to live in this new world, in the new environment they find themselves in. I mentioned earlier, um, if they signed a treaty, they had protections. They had some freedoms, but they were second class citizens. There were things that they could not do. They did not have the freedom. One of them is own a sword. They couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't be walking around with a sword. Um, and even horses. There's just this element of trying to kind of squall what could be a rebellion by having all these people with swords and weapons. It affects worship. They weren't allowed to beat drums or ring bells for worship. And so there is kind of this, they're not able to um express worship they went to. They have severe freedoms. And most importantly, and this is where like Francis of Assisi becomes important, is that they couldn't evangelize Muslims. So Christians were not allowed to convert Muslims, and Muslims were not allowed to convert to Christianity. And still to this day, lest they face death. I think that's one of the harder hurdles in a Muslim's life, is because of the closeness of family, the integralness of family, that becoming a Christian is like signing a death warrant for your life. It just isn't allowed. And so, the you know, these are there are these restrictions in it, and yet the Muslims are not ignorant of what Christianity brings. In Islamic schools, they would hire Christians who knew Greek so that they could translate the Greek philosophers into Arabic. That is how they were able to get kind of the knowledge of the Greeks. So you think of how they're employed there. They would use bishops as kind of a leader, a political leader for the Christians. So you start seeing this kind of political, they're kind of like this subnation within a larger nation, and their bishop, their the chief leader of their church is the political leader that would go to Islam. But even in that, while they had these freedoms, the Muslim leaders would often persecute Christians still, even though they had these freedoms. They weren't Christians were not immune from the persecutions that would come. So you go from having your freedoms to worship the way you want to, how you want to, and be able to defend yourself, to you're not even allowed to own a sword, and now you're susceptible to persecutions. Again, we see this today still, um, in Northern Africa, mostly, though it happens other places too. And so I think there's a lot of gloom as we think about this parts of church history. But God is still working. And in one case, he is working in a guy named John of Damascus. He was a bishop, the leader in Damascus. So he had a political um, ability. He knew Greek and Hebrew. He was very knowledgeable. He was one who believed in Chalcedonian theology. So you see in Damascus this faithful Christian in a position to be able to protect the Christianity and their freedom. He would later retire to Jerusalem, and he would write the Fountain of Knowledge. It's his greatest work, and basically talking about how does Christianity and Greek philosophy come together in the first part, about heresies in the second part, and then a robust theological treatise on orthodoxy and what we're to believe. And so even in this time, God is still working on people. I mean, churches are declining with these new rules. Like it seems very bleak, but God is still raising people up for the case of Christ, and to be able to continue to proclaim the gospel in the means that um, they are provided. And the gospel is still going forth, even though you have this anti-Christian, anti-God movement taking the world by force, taking the Western world, what we know as the Western world, by force.
Yeah. Very, very fascinating. And as we're coming down to the end of the program here today, I do want to reiterate that we are going to do a show here in the next few weeks or so, Lord willing, because again, life happens sometimes, where we're going to get into more of what Muslims believe, what they are taught from the Quran, because it is important. Again, as we mentioned, Muhammad was influenced by Christians and Jews. And some of these Christians, unfortunately, were Christians that were pushed out because they were teaching falsely. And so there's a combination of things that he brought in that are just wrong. But you see it in the Quran. You see some of this come forth in the Quran. And one of the things you also see in the Quran is he tells his people that when you get into trouble, go to the people of the book, meaning Jews and Christians, people of the book. So there was in the beginning this reverence or this respect for Christians and Jews. But when they no longer viewed him, because he tried to come in as just being this prophet, another prophet of God. And when they rejected that, then it got more political and more violent overall. But we will do a show where we get deeper into some of the beliefs of Islam here coming up in the near future here on G220 Radio. Mike, as we come down to the end here, go ahead and try to fade us on out as where you want to go before we end it.
Yeah, so we're now in a place to really start seeing what is happening in modern day France for the most part. What we'll see here coming forward is moving into the height of medieval theology, medieval teachings. There's still some more some issues to be hammered out. You have the Great Schism in the 1100s, but this is becoming a pivotal time. We talked about Gregory the Great and stuff that he's kind of set in motion. We're going to see the church really fill the vacuum of political power, unifying the medieval church into Christendom, with Charles the Great, and be able to come together because of this threat. You have that the Crusades are going to be starting soon. As we think about it, we're also covering a lot more history. History is gonna, in some sense, start flying a little bit more as we move into the Middle Ages, because now you're in sustained battles, as now these kind of two bigger powers are now trying to take control of the land. And I think so we're really going to see how Islam affects it. Mention St. Francis of Assisi, he's an evangelist to the Muslims. He's going to be rising up in this.
And he did use words.
He did use words, yeah. In fact, I read his we'll get it out for the show. I read his rules for his monastery, and they had words. And so, yeah, words were important. He used them to proclaim the gospel. But I think, and so we're really going to see, what we're seeing is the church fathers, that period is fading away into the sunset. And now we are entering into the land of the medieval church. And there is a lot that is going to happen, because we know history, where we're at now, and when the Protestant Reformation hits. We're essentially 800,000 years away. But a lot of stuff is going to happen in that time period that's going to set the stage for the Protestant Reformation. And so as we think about the medieval church, what this means for us, there is going to be theological developments that are going to happen that are started in the early church, that are wrongly used and developed, all the while that the church is trying to defend its power against this other religion called Islam. And I think it's and also, as kind of Reformed Christians, I think this is the period of time that we know the least about. Like, we know a lot about early church fathers, especially Augustine, and then we kind of jump over the medieval church and land in the Protestant Reformation. But there's a lot of stuff that happens here that we need to know about because of what it does. And I've mentioned it a couple times, but you have Thomas Aquinas, and we have to, in some sense, deal with him. He is a major figure in this time period that's going to be his theology is basically going to be the chief antagonist in the Protestant Reformation as it continues to develop past him. We're getting in some exciting times. I like the Church Fathers. It's very interesting, but I think the medieval church will help us as Reformed believers to better understand the importance of the Reformation, and that Luther wasn't the first. There are many people who are trying to reform the church, and we'll be able to take a look at a few of those, even though they're not technically part of the Reformation nor lay claim to the Reformation.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's been G220 Radio on this episode, talking about the rise of Islam in church history. And again, as we've said on our shows in the past, when we're dealing with Roman Catholicism, which we've done a couple interviews with a Roman Catholic, a couple different conversations with other Roman Catholics, and then had topics on this. When we mention the church, even we did on Eastern Orthodoxy, when we mention this early church, there's a shared common history where there is this church that God institutes, that Christ institutes, that is universally one body, and it's spread out. And as you see in the scriptures, Paul says, go around and appoint elders in each town, each city. You're going around, they're planting churches, appointing elders within these churches. But then you start to see the development throughout church history where there starts to be splits, where there starts to be individuals who take more power or assume more power or want to take more power. And this is important. We can't just say, well, it's church history, it belongs to Roman Catholics, or it belongs to Eastern Orthodox, well, and we're not a part of it. No, there's one church that's a part of this that continues to go on. Paul says it. Does God not fulfill his promises that he's promised? No, the elect obtain it. God always has an elect. He always has a remnant that carries the truth forward. And so you're going to see, as you mentioned, there's times where you're starting to see people, as we start to get more and more further along in church history, people were trying to reform areas where they saw wrongdoings, where they saw teaching that was contrary to the word of God. And then you get to the time where we talk about the Reformation, where we get to the time when we talk about the Reformation and see what God has done there to bring us back to the scriptures. And so when we say sola scriptura, again, it's not that we are saying church history doesn't matter, church fathers and the things that they've given us doesn't matter. We can learn from, we can benefit from much of church history, much of what they wrote. But it must be grounded in something that it does not change, that is not fallible, that is the word of God. And so as we continue, if you got any questions about this topic that we're talking about now, or anything as we're moving into the next areas of church history, getting into the Middle Ages, you got questions, you can email us at g220radio@gmail.com. Again, it is g220radio@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed the show tonight. We will be back with you again, Lord willing, next week on G220 Radio at 9 p.m. Eastern time. Again, if you're listening, you're catching the replay, you typically watch maybe or listen on Facebook, I want to encourage you, do so on YouTube. It seems to be the area where we have least amount of problems. So watch us over there on YouTube. We're also on Twitch. I don't really do a lot of interacting there on Twitch, but we did get a comment on Twitch. It might have just been a spam. But hey, you can watch over there too if that seems to be your place of choosing. But that's been G220 Radio. Until next time, God bless. And as always,
stay Baptist.
G220, shining the light, sharing his word both day and night. Stay Baptist, stay bold, truth and love, let the scriptures unfold. From creation to the